Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hewlett-Woodmere Public Library's presentation about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. My name is Dr. Bill THIERFELDER, and I will be your host today. Now, for those who may not know me, I'm a retired professor of arts and humanities and a docent emeritus at the American Museum of Natural History. I live in Portland, Oregon, where I'm speaking to you from today, and where I'm an artist, writer, and lecturer. I also go back regularly to my hometown of New York City, where I enjoy the wonders of the Big Apple and continue my work at the museum. Now, since I can't delve into every aspect of Ginsburg's life in one program, I'd like to invite you to visit my website, makingwings.net, where you can find much additional information at deeper dive number 6. So let me demonstrate for you. So that's one word, making wings, and it's .net. And I'm just making double sure here. You should be seeing on your screen now the home page. If you go into the upper left corner, it's called a hamburger menu because it's stacked like a hamburger. And you click on that, you're going to see a drop down. Please feel free to visit any of these, including this one, which is my lecture schedule, where you can find out where I'm speaking. And there we are at Hewlett, for example. There's today. So you can find out all kinds of information on my website about when and where, if you would like to do that. But for today, deeper dives. There are two groups. I said number 6, so it's in this first batch. Click on the downward arrow next to, and you're going to see more drop downs. These are all programs that I either have given or will be giving in the near future. And today is number 6, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And what you will find there is a brief overview of her life, some recommended media. I will be talking about some of these books during the presentation. So if you don't have a paper and pencil handy, it's here on my website. I also have some print as well as video resources, a timeline, and so forth. So there's all kinds of great goodies. If you do choose to go here, you can click on, so let's say you want a biography, you can click on that. And then when you are done, all you have to do is click it off, and then you're back on my page. So it's kind of one-stop shopping. So please take advantage of that. So let me close that out. And let's move on. I'd like to say that everything that you're going to hear in this program today uses the web resources and the books that you just saw on my website. But for this presentation, I especially used the following sources to build its structure and its script. Newsweek, CNBC and CNN, Oye, which is the Cornell University Law School website, and Wikipedia and the Biography channel. Now, one of the things that you also saw on my website was that listing of recommended media. The 2015 book Notorious RBG is terrific. And if you have young readers in your family, a 2017 Young Person's edition is equally fine. And that's, in fact, what I have on the screen there, the Young Readers edition. My Own Words from 2016 is a collection of Ginsburg's speeches and personal writings. You really get a flavor of the woman through this engaging memoir. And then there's Jane DeHart's biography, originally published in 2018. It's definitely the definitive look at her life. DeHart took over 15 years to write this book. It was reissued as a trade paperback in 2020, I think, with a few revisions. But I really hope that uh, she decides to add a couple of more chapters that cover the last 2 years of Ginsburg's life. Finally, Jeffrey Rosen's interviews and discussions with Ginsburg, called Conversations with RBG, is thought-provoking and thought-filled, and I totally recommend it. Now, if you'd like to view something about her life, well, then these two recent films are absolutely worth the price of admission. The award-winning documentary called RBG is delightful, and Mimi Lederer's 2019 film On the Basis of Sex, with Felicity Jones as Ginsburg and Armie Hammer as her husband Martin, is an accurate and loving look at the early years of her career. I also recommend I Dissent, which is a book for younger readers and a wonderful memoir by Nitin Totenberg of NPR called Dinners with Ruth. It's quite delightful. So, with all of that said, why don't we explore first some of the biographical background of her life before we get into the meat and potatoes of her remarkable career, her famous cases. So let's start out at the beginning. Uh, Joan Ruth Bader was born on the Ides of March 15th of 1933. She was the younger of the two children of Nathan Bader, who was a merchant, and Celia Bader, who was a homemaker. They lived in Flatbush, Brooklyn, which you see in the lower left of your screen. Their home, by the way, is in the center of your screen. It was a very tightly knit family, and I absolutely love that picture of Ginsburg as a little girl on your right. Now, sadly, tragedy struck when Ginsburg was 14 months old. Her elder sister, Marilyn, died of meningitis at the age of 6, and it was a deeply traumatic experience for the family. Now, outside her family, Ginsburg began to go by the name Ruth in kindergarten to help her teachers distinguish her from other students named Joan who were in her class. But within her family, well, Ruth had a nickname. It was Kiki, the name that her late sister Marilyn called her because she was such a kicky little baby. Now, though not devout, the Baders were an observant Jewish family, and Ruth attended the Midwood Jewish Center on Ocean Avenue in Brooklyn, which you see on the left of your screen. I used to live in Park Slope, Brooklyn, and when I bicycled down to Coney Island, down Ocean Avenue, I would pass this synagogue all the time. She participated in Jewish traditions as a child, including leading Sabbath prayers on Friday evenings. And until she was 18, she was also a counselor at Chinawa, a Jewish summer camp in the Adirondacks owned by her mother's brother, Saul. Now, on the right side of your screen, you see a 1948 photo of her leading a Friday evening service at camp when she was 15. Now, she excelled in school. She was never expelled, that's for sure. She excelled in school, where she was heavily involved in student activities and earned excellent grades. Now, to go along with her studies, her mother, Celia, introduced her to the arts, the sciences, and the humanities. Now, this immersion, among other things, created a lifelong passion for opera, enhanced by early visits to the Metropolitan Opera, which you see on your screen, the old opera house on 39th Street. Now, while she was close to her father, she was much closer to her mother. So much so that in later life, RBG had a framed photo of her on her desk wherever she worked. More of that actually a little later on. Now, unfortunately, at about the time when Ruth started high school at James Madison High School in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, which you see over there on the left of your screen, Celia, the mom, was diagnosed with cancer. So all the while Ruth was trying to have a normal high school life, as you can see in the photo on the right, she was also playing caregiver to an increasingly ill mother. Celia died of the disease 4 years later in June of 1950, just days before Ruth's scheduled commencement ceremony. As a result, Ruth couldn't attend her own high school graduation. Well, needless to say, Ruth was devastated by her mother's passing. And to add to the misery, when she and other women in the family were sitting Shiva, the Orthodox members of the family didn't allow them to pray the mourner's prayer, the Kaddish. This experience reinforced her increasing move towards secular Judaism and certainly spurred her early interest in women's rights. Now, later in 1950, Ruth faced a major decision: stay at home to take care of her grieving father or attend college, something she desperately wanted to do. Well, after much soul searching, she decided on going to school. Leaving her father in the hands of relatives, Ruth entered Cornell University on a full scholarship. And it was during her first semester she met her future husband, Marty Ginsburg, who was, like she was, a member of the student council at Cornell. Well, Martin, who eventually became a nationally prominent tax attorney, exerted an important influence on Ruth through his strong and sustained interest in her intellectual pursuits. He remained her greatest champion for the rest of his life, a knight in shining armor, a real mensch who remained in awe of her prodigious talents. Now, she was also deeply influenced by two other people, both Cornell professors. The great author Vladimir Nabokov, who shaped her thinking about writing, and the constitutional lawyer Robert Cushman, who inspired her to pursue a legal career. Well, Martin and Ruth were married in June of 1954, just 9 days after she graduated from Cornell. Now, the joke for the rest of their lives was that while she did her studies and legal work, he did the cooking, because apparently she was a complete disaster in the kitchen. She could burn boiling water, was one comment I read. Indeed, his culinary skills eventually over time became famous, and people clamored for the couple's dinner parties. I love the photo on your right, taken later in life, which humorously depicts their two roles. She's the judge, he's the chef. Now, after Martin was drafted into the U.S. Army, the Ginsburg spent 2 years in Oklahoma, where he was stationed. Their daughter Jane, their first child, was born during this time in July of 1955. See a picture of her now as an adult in the lower left of your screen. She would also go on to become a remarkable legal mind. Currently, Jane is a professor of literary and artistic property law at the Columbia Law School. She also directs Columbia University's Center for Law, Media, and the Arts. And in 2011, Jane was elected to the British Academy, the United Kingdom's National Academy for Humanities and the Social Sciences. Clearly, brilliance runs in the family. And before I leave this page, I just love this slide of the family playing together. So cool. Well, in the fall of 1956, after Marty's tour of duty was over, the Ginsburg moved to Massachusetts, where Martin resumed and Ruth began studies at Harvard Law School. RBG was one of only 9 women in a class of about 500 men. Now, while Ruth completed her coursework, she was also the first woman to serve as the editorial staff director of the Harvard Law Review. But an echo of her high school years emerged during this period, just as she had been a devoted caregiver to her mother while trying to maintain her academic life at James Madison High School. So, while maintaining her rigorous academic life at Harvard and trying to be a good mother to Jane, she acted as caregiver to Martin, who had been diagnosed with testicular cancer. Thankfully, unlike her mother, Marty survived. Now, after a long and very difficult recovery, remember, this is the 1950s, so a lot of modern medicine was not there. After this long and difficult recovery, Marty graduated from Harvard and accepted a job with a law firm in New York City. After discussion, the couple decided to move. So, as a result of the move, Ruth completed her legal education at Columbia Law School, where she was invited to serve on their law review. Another remarkable achievement. And to top it off, she graduated in a tie for first place in her class of 1959. Now, unfortunately, despite her excellent credentials, she struggled to find employment as a lawyer. First, because of her gender, and second, because she was a mother. Women who were mothers were expected to stay at home and raise their children. The concept of a quote unquote working mother simply didn't exist in the late 50s, early 60s, and certainly not the way it does today. Uh, and it didn't exist because it was considered an aberration, and in some circles, a willful disavowal of quote unquote womanly duty. Indeed, in the late 1950s and early 60s, only a very small percentage of lawyers in the United States were women, and only 2 women had ever served as federal judges up to that point. Fortunately, one of her Columbia law professors advocated on her behalf and helped to convince Judge Edmund Palmieri of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York to offer Ginsburg a clerkship. You see him in the upper right of your screen. She was offered the job, and she gladly took it, clerking for Judge Palmieri from 1959 to 1961. By 1962, she became the associate director of the Columbia Law School's project on international procedure. During that period, 1962 and 1963, with Marty's full support, she traveled to Sweden with little Jane. You could see Jane with her mom in the photo on your left in Sweden. There, RBG, I'm assuming that is a photo from Sweden, by the way. I couldn't find the exact location. I'm assuming it's the photo that kept coming up whenever I did a Google search of Ginsburg and Sweden. That was the photo that kept coming up. So we'll say that it is. In any event, in Sweden, RBG studied Swedish civil procedure at Lund University, which you see on your screen over there on your right. Her research was published in 1965 in a book called Civil Procedure in Sweden, which was co-authored with Anders Brasilius, a highly regarded Swedish judge and a faculty member at Lund. Her work was further rewarded in 1969 when she was given an honorary degree from Lund University for her contributions to the studies of Swedish law. Meanwhile, in the same period that she was working on Swedish law, she was hired by the Rutgers School of Law, Rutgers University in New Jersey, as an assistant professor. However, it was definitely 1963, for the dean of the law school asked her to accept a lower salary than the male faculty. Why? Because of her husband's well-paying job. Well, she wasn't in a position to decline, so she reluctantly accepted. But a year into her work at the university, she became pregnant with her son James, who was born in 1965. So the two children are 10 years apart. Now, to hide her condition, she wore oversized clothes around campus for fear her contract wouldn't be renewed. Fortunately, her pregnancy went pretty much unnoticed, and she remained on the faculty, and she eventually earned tenure in 1969. Now, meanwhile, like his sister Jane, James Stephen Ginsburg has gone on to have a brilliant career. He is an American music producer and president of Sadil Records, a classical music label he launched in 1989 while he was a student at the University of Chicago. His vision was to provide local musicians with a recording home. For over 2 decades, it was the only Chicago-based classical music label, and today remains a premier recording company. Now, as a sidebar, you can see his mother's influence, can't you? Ruth, her son, and her arts-oriented daughter all share a passion for classical music, which they in turn got from Grandma Celia. Now, 1970. This becomes a pivotal year in RBG's life. She became professionally involved in the issue of gender equality when she was asked to introduce and moderate a law student panel on the topic of, quote unquote, women's liberation. Well, that experience began her lifelong relationship with the National Organization for Women, the NOW organization, NOW. Now, on the left is a photo of RBG with Gloria Steinem having afternoon tea. And on the right, well, there is a powerhouse lineup from the 1970s, all of whom became very close to Ginsburg. So there from left to right, you see Betty Friedan, Eleanor Guggenheimer, Eleanor Holmes Norton, and Gloria Steinem, and they're there at an early meeting of the National Women's Caucus. Now, continuing along those lines, in 1971, she taught a seminar on the topics of women's liberation and discrimination against women at Rutgers. As part of the course that she taught there, Ginsburg partnered with the American Civil Liberties Union to draft briefs for 2 federal cases. The first, originally brought to her attention by her husband, involved a provision of the federal tax code that denied single men a tax deduction for serving as caregivers to their families. In other words, unmarried or widowed men could also be the victims in certain circumstances of sexual discrimination. The second case involved an Idaho state law that expressly preferred men to women in determining who should administer the estates of people who die without a will. In other words, die intestate. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision in the latter case, Reed versus Reed, 1971, was the first in which a gender-based statute was struck down on the basis of the Equal Protection Clause. Now, during the remainder of the 1970s, Ginsburg was a leading figure in gender discrimination litigation. In 1972, she became founding counsel of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project, the WRP, and co-authored a law school casebook on gender discrimination. In the same year, after 9 years at Rutgers, she became the first female faculty member at the Columbia Law School. She authored dozens of law review articles and drafted or contributed to many Supreme Court briefs on the issue of gender discrimination. So, with all of these remarkable episodes under her belt, Ginsburg began her groundbreaking life in the court. And as she said, my life in court begins. So let's look at some of the highlights of her experiences. During the 1970s, she argued before the Supreme Court 6 times, winning 5 of those 6 cases. And of those winners, one of the most famous was the 1973 case of Air Force Lieutenant Sharon Frontiero. Frontiero versus Richardson became a landmark case. The court's ruling decided that benefits given by the United States military to the family of a service member could not be given out differently because of gender. Now, the impetus for this case happened when Frontiero applied for benefits for her dependent husband. She did that. She was told she'd have to prove that he was a dependent, even though men in the Air Force didn't have to prove that their wives were dependent on them. Well, the Frontiero decision became important in several respects, including the fact that it informed the military establishment that in terms of pay, allowances, and general treatment, women must be considered on an equal plane as men. Ginsburg argued used the statute to argue that gender-based discrimination hurt men too. Why, she asked the court during oral arguments, did the framers of the 14th Amendment regard racial discrimination as odious? Well, because a person's skin color bears no necessary relationship to ability. Similarly, a person's gender bears no necessary relationship to ability. The court ruled 8-1 for Frontiero. The case became the first successful sex discrimination lawsuit against the federal government. Justice William Brennan argued that the differential treatment towards men in the armed forces, simply for, he called it, administrative convenience, amounted to discrimination against female members and did not pass constitutional muster. 1980 was another banner year. President Jimmy Carter appointed Ginsburg to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit in Washington, D.C. While serving as judge on the D.C. Circuit, Ginsburg developed a reputation as a pragmatic liberal with a keen attention to detail. Yet, despite her liberal leanings, she also enjoyed cordial professional relationships with 2 well-known conservative judges who were also on the circuit court, Robert Bork on the left and Antonin Scalia in the middle. In fact, she often voted with them. And along those lines, in 1993, she delivered the Madison Lecture at New York University Law, offering a critique of the reasoning, though not the ultimate holding, of Roe v. Wade, the famous 1973 ruling that was recently overturned, in which the Supreme Court at the time found a constitutional right of women to choose to have an abortion. Ginsburg argued that the court should have issued a more limited decision, which would have left more room for state legislatures to address specific details relevant to their specific states, which, by the way, is exactly the decision that was recently handed down that overturned Roe v. Wade. Such an approach, Ginsburg claimed, might have served to reduce rather than to fuel controversy. So, though she supported Roe v. Wade as a woman's rights issue, she might have actually agreed with some aspects of the reasoning presented by conservative judges who overturned Roe in June of 2022. So, the point is that though she was liberal, she always tended to side with states' rights advocates in such issues, even when she advocated for women's rights. Of course, obviously, we'll never know how she would have voted in 2022, but it's an interesting thing to keep in mind. Now, on June the 14th of 1993, President Bill Clinton announced his nomination of Ginsburg to the Supreme Court to replace retiring Justice Byron White. Her confirmation hearings were quick and relatively uncontroversial. She was endorsed unanimously by the Senate Judiciary Committee and confirmed by the full Senate on August the 3rd. It was confirmed by a vote of 96-3. Only Jesse Helms, Don Nichols, and Bob Smith of North Carolina, Oklahoma, and New Hampshire, respectively, three arch conservative senators, voted against her. Otherwise, everyone voted for her. Now, as a lovely side note, once she was sworn in and settled in her offices, whenever she left her court offices at the end of the day, she would look at the picture of her mother that she always carried with her and would say, she would have been proud of me. Remember that story from earlier in this presentation, that she always carried a picture of her mom, always put it on her desk. And apparently every day when she left, she would kind of give a tip of the hat, as it were, and she would say, you would be proud of me, Mom. Now, on the court, Ginsburg became well known for two things. One, of course, was her active participation in oral arguments. I mean, she's a brilliant speaker. She wrote remarkable opinions. But the other thing that she was known for was her habit of wearing special collars called jabots. Now, as you see on your screen, Ginsburg had a wide collection, including lace jabots from around the world. She had a particular jabot she wore when issuing her dissents. It was black with gold embroidery and faceted stones, as well as another she wore when issuing majority opinions. Those were crocheted yellow with crystals, which was a gift from her law clerks. Now you can see that one on your screen in the lower right over there. Okay, excuse me, the lower right. That's the majority opinion jabot. You can see quite something. Her favorite jabot, however, was one that she received as a gift. And here's the little yellow marker there, herself, which was given to her from some friends in Cape Town, South Africa. So anyway, she became famous for these beautiful jabots. And you can see she has a whole lineup there in her closet. Now, in 1996, Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion for the famous United States versus Virginia case, which held that only men could be admitted into the state-run university, the Virginia Military Institute. The case said that violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. rejecting VMI's contention that its program of military-focused education was unsuitable for women because it was too physically and mentally demanding. Ginsburg argued that generations, generalizations about the way women are and estimates of what is appropriate for most women no longer justify denying opportunity to women whose talent and capacity place them outside the average. Okay, so let me read that again. It should have popped up on your screen, and unfortunately it didn't. This phrase is generalizations about the way women are, that's in air quotes, and estimates of what is appropriate, in air quotes, for most women, no longer justify denying opportunity to women whose talent and capacity place them outside the average. The court gave VMI a vigorous defeat. Now, on a personal note, although Ginsburg tended to vote with other liberal justices on the court, she got along well with the conservative justices who had been appointed before her. She enjoyed an especially close connection with Sandra Day O'Connor, seen on the left, who was a moderate conservative and who was the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court. The media loved their friendship, and they were quickly dubbed the sisters-in-law. Even more famous was her friendship with conservative Justice Antonin Scalia. Their bond often centered on their mutual passion for opera. Not only did they go to the opera together, they sometimes appeared as extras in productions, including the Washington Opera's 1994 production of Richard Strauss's Ariadne auf Naxos, which is pictured in the center of your screen, powdered wigs and all. And in 2015, the American composer-lyricist Derek Wang wrote a successful comic opera called Scalia Ginsburg, celebrating their relationship. And then, oh yes, there's that 1994 trip to India where she and Scalia rode an elephant together, much to the absolute delight of the Indian press. So picking up on that, before we move on, I wanted to share a short clip from CBS News that was broadcast in 2016, shortly after the death of Justice Antonin Scalia and before the election of Donald Trump the first time. Now, as we know, partisan politics has been at an all-time high in the past decade. Well, this presentation reminds us that differing points of view don't have to lead to war and bloodshed. Now, you may have to adjust the sound on your devices, and as is sometimes the case, YouTube videos don't have the best of closed captions, but better than nothing. So here you go, just a couple of minutes.
Finally tonight, at a time when right and left rarely intersect, Supreme Court Justices Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg proved that people can disagree and yet remain friends. Jan Crawford watched their friendship blossom through the years.
When we think about Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg, they were in many ways complete opposites. I mean, there was the rough and tumble Scalia. He cut his teeth in the Nixon administration. And then the soft-spoken Ginsburg, she started her career arguing for women's rights. But they had this deep and affectionate friendship. Justice Ginsburg has this fabulous picture in her office of the two of them. They're riding an elephant on a trip to India. And they both loved the opera. They're even dressed in costume in one picture that they have. And they would do things with their spouses together, too. I mean, they would all spend New Year's Eve together. They would have these regular dinners. Their friendship goes back to their days serving on the Federal Appeals Court in Washington. And it was always wonderful just to hear them talk about their relationship.
And I was listening to him and disagreeing with a good part of what he said. But thought he said it in an absolutely captivating way.
I think we should leave it at that. Great point.
We agree on a whole lot of stuff.
We do.
Ruth is really bad only on the knee-jerk stuff. She is.
They had a mutual respect, but they didn't compromise. In her statement yesterday, Justice Ginsburg said that his critiques, and Scalia could have some doozies, believe me, made her better. Justice Scalia nailed all the weak spots, the applesauce and the argle-bargle, that's some typical colorful Scalia language for you, and gave me just what I needed to strengthen the majority opinion. Within hours of Scalia's death, the partisan divide here in Washington went into overdrive. But their relationship proved that you could be deeply divided and still be civil. I think Ginsburg put it best when she said, "We were best buddies. It was my great good fortune to have known him as a working colleague and treasured friend."
There you go. Okay,
Washington.
let me close that out. So, frankly, right? There's a lot for us to learn, especially now in America, not just from their friendship, but for their intellectual jousting. Just because you have differing opinions doesn't mean you can't form deep admiration and respect for someone else. Scalia often wrote pitiless opinions, yet Ginsburg chose not to take them personally and sometimes actually viewed them appreciatively. Bottom line, they fed off each other in a way that today's gladiatorial politics doesn't seem to allow. We could all learn a little something from that beautiful friendship. Now, in 1999, Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion in Olmstead versus LC, in which the court ruled by a margin of 6-3 that mental illness is a form of disability covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. In the Olmstead case, the plaintiffs, L.C., Lois Curtin, and E.W., Elaine Wilson, you see them in the upper left of your screen, they were two women who were diagnosed with schizophrenia, intellectual disability, and personality disorder. They had both been treated in institutional settings and in community-based treatments in the state of Georgia. Following clinical assessments by state employees, both plaintiffs were determined to be better suited for treatment in a community-based setting rather than in an institution. Yet both women remained confined in an institution for several years after the initial treatment was concluded. The two women sued the state of Georgia to prevent them from being further treated and housed in an institutional setting. In that 6-3 decision, the court decided that mental illness is a form of disability and that, according to Ginsburg's statement, unjustified isolation of a person with a disability is a form of discrimination under Title II of the Americans with Disability Act. Now, this landmark ruling, really quite something. It's a landmark because for the first time, it requires states to eliminate unnecessary segregation of persons with disabilities and to ensure that persons with disabilities, including mental illness, receive services in the most integrated setting appropriate to their needs. Now, I absolutely love the photo of Lois Curtin there on your right, explaining the meaning of one of her paintings to President Obama. I'm not quite sure he gets it, so she's having to point, this is this, and this is this, and he's kind of looking. It's kind of fun. I love the picture. Now, in 2000, Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion in Friends of the Earth versus Laidlaw Environmental Services, in which the court held that residents have standing to seek fines from an industrial polluter that had affected their interests and that they could be able to continue doing so even if the immediate problem had been resolved. Okay, let me explain. This was the question before the court. Does an environmental group's lawsuit become moot when the defendant, after commencement of the litigation, has come into compliance with the law. See, initially, Laidlaw had severely polluted the North Tiger River in South Carolina. You see that across the middle of your screen there. They had polluted it. But Laidlaw actually corrected their pollution issues while the lawsuit was moving along through the lower courts. Well, the Friends of the Earth group argued that that didn't change the fact that the recreational area had been unusable and that people had become ill. Well, the Supreme Court agreed with the Friends of the Earth and said that fixing the problem now did not change the damage that had been done before. Citizens have a right to sue for past damages, even if the situation has been rectified. The court ruled 7-2 in favor of those affected, and only Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia dissented. But even a hero can have a dark chapter. And this 2005 case proved to be very dark for Ginsburg. RBG wrote a section of the majority opinion for the City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York case and concluded that the Oneida Indian Nation could not revive its ancient sovereignty over its historic land. In an 8-1 opinion delivered by Justice Ginsburg, the court held that the Oneida Nation couldn't revive its ancient sovereignty over land that it had given up decades before. The court pointed to the long-standing, distinctively non-Indian character of central New York and its inhabitants, as well as the fact that the Oneida Nation had given up authority over the land over 200 years before. By giving up their lands in the early 19th century, the Oneidas had, quote, relinquished their governmental reins, unquote, and couldn't regain them, including trying to buy them back from current title holders. Now, lower courts later relied on Ginsburg's opinion in this case as precedents to extinguish Native American land claims. Meanwhile, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has noted that Ginsburg's opinion and similar court rulings regarding Indian lands are socially unjust, racist, and in violation of basic and fundamental human rights. In her later years, Ginsburg said openly that she regretted her decision in Sherrill versus Oneida more than any other decision she ever made in court. She admitted her mistake, but it was too late to undo her decision. Well, just as Ginsburg became known for her brilliant majority opinions, she attracted equal attention for several strongly worded dissenting opinions, which she read publicly from the bench to emphasize the importance of the case. Two such decisions in 2007 concerned women's rights. The first, Gonzalez versus Carhart, upheld the federal Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act on a 5-4 vote. Ginsburg decried the judgment as alarming, arguing that it cannot be understood as anything other than an effort to chip away at a right declared again and again by this court, meaning Roe v. Wade, which is kind of interesting. She was very divided on this issue in some respects. In this case, she was a little annoyed. Similarly, in Ledbetter versus Goodyear Tire, another 5-4 decision, Ginsburg criticized the majority's holding that a woman could not bring a federal civil suit against her employer for having paid her less than it paid men. Ginsburg argued that the majority's reasoning was inconsistent with the will of the United States Congress. And that was a view that was vindicated when Congress passed the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act in 2009, which was the first bill that Barack Obama signed into law. There's a little bit of Jeopardy trivia for you. What was the first bill that President Obama signed? Well, it was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. Now, famously, Ginsburg was credited with influencing her colleagues on a 2009 students' rights case, Safford United School District versus Reading. The court ruled that a school went too far in ordering a 13-year-old female student to strip to her bra and underpants so female officials could search for drugs, specifically ibuprofen, which the school considered to be a quote-unquote drug. In an interview published prior to the court's decision, Ginsburg shared her view that some of her male colleagues could not fully appreciate the effect of a strip search on a 13-year-old girl because they'd never been a little girl. In an 8-1 decision, the court agreed that the school's search went too far and violated the Fourth Amendment's ban against unreasonable searches and seizures. Clarence Thomas was the only dissenting justice, who argued that the judiciary should not meddle with decisions school administrators make that are in the interest of keeping their schools safe. But Judge Ginsburg, along with Justice Stevens, countered Thomas in their opinion, saying, "It does not require a constitutional scholar to conclude that a nude search of a 13-year-old child is an invasion of constitutional rights of some magnitude." So in 2009, Justice David Souter retired, and the following year, Justice John Paul Stevens retired. With these two resignations, Ginsburg became the most senior justice within the liberal bloc. From 2010 until her death 10 years later, Ginsburg continued to write dissents, articulating liberal perspectives in several prominent and politically charged cases, and as well as majority opinions. But it was those dissenting ones that were particularly strong. One of these dissenting decisions was particularly contentious. Shortly after Congress passed the Affordable Care Act in 2010, Florida and 12 other states brought actions in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Florida, seeking a declaration that the ACA was unconstitutional on several grounds. These states were subsequently joined by 13 additional states, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, and two individual plaintiffs. These states, businesses, and plaintiffs argued that, one, the individual mandate, which would penalize citizens who didn't have health insurance, exceeded Congress's powers under the Commerce Clause. Two, the Medicare expansions were unconstitutionally coercive. And three, the employer mandate impermissibly interfered with sovereignty, state sovereignty. Now, the case made its way to the Supreme Court, which ultimately upheld the ACA, but in subsequent legislation passed by Congress in 2019, the individual mandate was struck down. And that move certainly didn't please Ginsburg, and she wrote quite a biting dissent on that one. In Shelby versus Holder, a now infamous 2013 case, the court's conservative majority struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which had required certain states and local jurisdictions to obtain prior approval, pre-clearance, from the Federal Justice Department of any proposed changes to voting laws or procedures within those states. Well, the conservatives argued that Section 4 of the Act was no longer needed because times had changed and things were now more uniformly fair when it came to voting. Well, Ginsburg, in a vigorous dissent, cited the hubris of the majority's demolition of the Voting Rights Act and declared that throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you personally are not getting wet. Absolutely love it. And that, by the way, gives you a great idea. The woman was just a master with words. Well, as you can see from the map in the upper right of your screen, many states, especially in the South, were affected by the court's decision. Many people, especially minority communities, feel that they were negatively affected. And we have seen since the court's ruling in 2013, several, mainly southern states, have made it much more difficult for minority communities to vote, as you can see in the map in the lower right. And of course, now it is not just the Deep South, it's gone into the Midwest and the mountain states as well. This is still in the news, of course, because the Supreme Court has basically killed what little is left of the Voting Rights Act. But as I like to say, stay tuned. Now, on a happier note, Justice Ginsburg was a lifelong trailblazer, most famously as a woman, but also as an advocate for LGBTQ plus rights. She played a significant role in legalizing same-sex marriage when, in June of 2013, she was one of the majority in the United States versus Windsor that struck down a federal law barring federal recognition of same-sex marriage. This gave significant impetus to the progress of lawsuits that challenged state bans on same-sex marriage in federal court. And you can see on your screen Edith Windsor in front of the court, who could now legally inherit the estate from her deceased wife without financial penalty. Meanwhile, within months, Ginsburg became the first Supreme Court justice to perform a same-sex marriage ceremony. Simply put, RBG helped many men and women break barriers and form their families. One of the first weddings that she officiated at was for Ralph Palacio, you can see him on the left, and Dr. James Vance on the right. The Manhattan couple was together for more than 30 years before tying the knot on October the 26th of 2013. They became the first gay couple to get married at the Supreme Court. Of course, just as with Roe v. Wade decision, there is a move afoot to overturn the Windsor verdict. So we're going to have to wait on that one. And once again, as I say, stay tuned. In 2014, Ginsburg was highly critical of the majority's opinion in Burwell versus Hobby Lobby stores, a decision that recognized the right for for-profit corporations to refuse on religious grounds to comply with the Affordable Care Act's requirement that employers pay for coverage of certain contraceptive drugs and devices in their employees' health insurance plans. Ginsburg wrote in the minority that the court had ventured into a minefield by holding that commercial enterprises can opt out of any law, except tax laws, that they judge incompatible with their sincerely held religious beliefs. Now, as we know, this too is still a very hot issue in political and religious circles, as well as with some of the currently conservative jurists sitting on the Supreme Court bench. So, yes, it's another. Stay tuned. Now, as another aside, throughout her career, Ginsburg concluded her dissents with the phrase, "I dissent," rather than the conventional and more commonly used phrase, "I respectfully dissent." Why? Because she considered it unnecessary, and she felt it was really disingenuous. It was a nicety. The quote is, over on your right. My dissenting opinions, like my briefs, are intended to persuade, and sometimes one must be forceful about saying how wrong the court's decision is. Now, in part, because of her increasing outspokenness, Ginsburg became, especially during the Obama administration, a progressive feminist folk hero. In fact, inspired by some of her dissents, a second-year law student at New York University, Shanna Koniznik, created a Tumblr blog entitled The Notorious RBG, a play on Notorious B.I.G., the stage name of the American rapper Christopher Wallace. And it immediately became a popular nickname for Ginsburg among her admirers, the Notorious RBG. Then, on June the 26th of 2015, in a 5-4 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down all state laws and regulations that banned same-sex marriage, legalizing it in all 50 states. The decision further required that states had to honor out-of-state same-sex marriage license, and Ginsburg helped to write that majority opinion. So this was a two-part process. First, the court said the federal government had to recognize same-sex marriage in 2013. And then it made such marriages legal in all 50 states in 2015 in the Obergefell versus Hodges case. And through it all, RBG was there in the front line. Ginsburg and the other majority said this: the Constitution promises liberty to all within its reach, and that same-sex couples ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right. Now, so far, the current Supreme Court has not argued against either the 2013 or the 2015 decisions, but once again, you know what I like to say. Stay tuned. But as she grew older and iconic, some liberals, citing Ginsburg's advancing age and concerns about her health and apparent frailty, argued that she should retire in order to allow Obama to nominate a liberal replacement. Other liberals, however, pointed out her vigorous exercise routine and the fact that she had never missed an oral argument. They urged that she should remain on the court for as long as possible. For her own part, Ginsburg expressed her intention to continue for as long as she was able to perform her job full steam. In fact, on the day after her beloved husband Marty died in 2019, she was back at work at the court, as usual, because she said it was what Marty would have wanted. Now, in a 2016 interview, Ginsburg expressed dismay at the possibility that Republican candidate Donald Trump would be elected president, a statement that was widely criticized by the right as not in keeping with the court's tradition of staying out of politics. The New York Post front page, excuse me, it gives you an idea of the blowback, and I do like that headline, Darth Vader, love it. Ginsburg later said that she regretted the remark, but meanwhile, with Trump's electoral victory, there was renewed criticism of Ginsburg for not having retired with Obama when Obama was president, while he was president. She should have resigned. Well, she remained on the court as the oldest justice, publicly mindful of John Paul Stevens' service until the age of 90. But sadly, the worst fear of many became true. Ginsburg died from the complications of pancreatic cancer on September the 18th of 2020, at the age of 87, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, something that many Jews around the country actually saw as a rather beautiful thing. She was a hero, closing out the year. Meanwhile, After the announcement of her death, thousands of people gathered in front of the Supreme Court building to lay flowers, light candles, and leave messages. 5 days after her death, the 8 Supreme Court justices, Ginsburg's 2 children, and other family members held a private ceremony for Ginsburg in the court's Great Hall. Following that private ceremony, Ginsburg's casket was moved outdoors so the public could pay respects. Thousands of mourners lined up to walk past the casket for over 2 days. After those 2 days in repose at the court, Ginsburg lay in state in the Capitol building. She was the first woman and the first Jew to lie in state in the rotunda. But wait a minute, you might say. What about Rosa Parks? Wasn't she honored in the rotunda in 2005 after her death? Well, she was, but with a distinction of terminology. Ginsburg is considered the first woman to lie in state at the Capitol because she was a member of the Supreme Court, and only government officials lie in state in the rotunda. Rosa Parks, who was a private citizen when she died at the age of 92, was accorded the recognition of lying in honor in the Capitol rotunda. A little trivia there for you. And so our story ends on September the 29th of 2020, when Ginsburg was buried beside her beloved Marty in Arlington National Cemetery. Now, the impact of Ginsburg cannot be underestimated, and her example remains bright, as witnessed by this beautiful mural painted by Allison McClay in 2020 on the side of a home in Southwest Portland, Oregon, where I live. And it says, "The struggle continues." Indeed it does. So, there you have it. What a remarkable, inspiring life she led. One that continues to inspire millions of people, especially women, especially in these politically fraught days. She truly was a trailblazer. So, remember that you can do much more research by going to deeper dive number 6 on my website, makingwings.net. And now, before we talk about next month's program, it's time for you to share your thoughts and ideas about today's program. Thank you for being here.